What if I told you the biggest financial bet most Britons ever make might be quietly rigged against them? What if the UK housing market doesn't behave like a normal market at all, but more like a system that only works as long as new money keeps pouring in? If you're serious about changing how you think about money, housing, and your future, watch this video until the very end, because what you're about to hear could completely reshape the decisions you make next. So the big question is this: is the UK housing market massively overvalued, heading for a crash, or are today's prices actually justified? Let's find out. The housing market seesaw. The easiest way to understand the UK housing market is to imagine a seesaw. Before 2026, almost all the weight was pushing prices up. Ultra-low interest rates, a belief that house prices only go up. Buy-to-let confidence, inherited wealth flooding the market, chronic underbuilding, or so we're told. But recently, the balance has shifted hard in the opposite direction. Now the downward forces are heavier. Much higher interest rates, falling buyer confidence, expectations of price drops, buy-to-let investors exiting, and affordability hitting breaking point. To see how extreme this has become, let's zoom into a real place. When a garage costs a lifetime, this is Rose Hill Estate in Oxford, one of the city's largest council estates. It was built to provide affordable housing. Today, most of it is privately owned. It's considered one of the cheapest areas in Oxford. And yet, a modest three-bed semi-detached house can easily sell for £350,000. That's more than 10 times the average Oxford salary. An average earner on £35,000 might qualify for a mortgage of around £100,000. In Oxford, that won't buy you a home. It might not even buy you a garage. This isn't just an Oxford problem, it's a national one. The broken price to income rule. 27 years ago, the average UK house price was about £51,000, roughly 3 times the average salary. Today, the average price is around £265,000. That's 7 times average earnings. By official ONS measures, it's closer to 9 times. For most of the post-war period, house prices sat comfortably between 3 to 4 times income, a level banks could safely lend against. That rule has been completely broken. So why didn't the system collapse sooner? Low rates and the Ponzi-like loop. The first reason is simple: interest rates. For nearly 2 decades, mortgage rates were pushed to historic lows. That made housing incredibly attractive, not just as a place to live, but as an investment. Why buy bonds earning next to nothing when property prices kept rising? This created a self-reinforcing loop. Rising prices encouraged investors to buy. Buying pushed prices higher. Higher prices justified even more buying. But this kind of system only works under 2 conditions: low interest rates and rising prices. Break either one, and everything changes. Now we've broken both. When rates rise, the music stops. Take a £300,000 mortgage. At 2% interest, many landlords could just about make the numbers work, even with modest rent. At 6%, many are losing money, even with record-high rents. This is why today feels eerily similar to 1991 and 2007. And while people say rates are still low historically, they ignore one key fact. Mortgage debt is far higher than ever before. If prices start falling, investors don't rush in. They step back. No one wants to buy a property today and watch it fall into negative equity tomorrow. When investors stop buying or start selling, it creates a negative feedback loop, and renters don't escape either. The system becomes more unstable for everyone. We've seen this movie before: the UK in 1991, the global crash of 2008, Canada and New Zealand, recently seeing 20% price drops. But there's one argument always used to dismiss these warnings. Is the housing shortage a myth? We're constantly told the UK has a desperate housing shortage, that we simply don't build enough homes. But when you actually look at the data, things get interesting. Between 2011 and 2025, the number of households in England and Wales rose by 6%, about 1.4 million. The number of dwellings in England alone rose by nearly 2 million. In other words, supply grew faster than demand. Yes, there are severe shortages in specific places like London and Oxford, And yes, private renting is in crisis. But nationally, the idea of an extreme overall shortage is often overstated. And if prices aren't being held up by supply shortages, they're far more exposed to interest rates and income pressure. So how are people still buying? The bank of mom and dad effect. Here's the real answer: wealth, not wages. The UK has become much better at increasing wealth and income, especially for the top 20%. And the biggest driver of that wealth? Rising house prices themselves. Older generations, particularly baby boomers, have benefited enormously. But instead of spending it all, many are passing it on. In 2021 alone, the Bank of Mum and Dad contributed around £10 billion to first-time buyers. Over the last decade, that number reaches a staggering £54 billion. That's roughly 26% of all funds entering the housing market. It explains how the average first-time buyer deposit reached £60,000. This creates something close to a reverse Ponzi effect. Rising prices create wealth. Wealth is gifted. Gifts push prices even higher. But it also creates brutal inequality. If your parents own property, you have a chance. If they don't, the ladder is almost unreachable. Stagnant incomes, weak growth, hard limits. For decades after the war, the UK enjoyed steady real income growth of around 2.5% a year. Since 2007, that engine has stalled. Productivity has slowed. Living standards have flatlined. The UK still hasn't properly recovered its pre-crisis growth path. Even with low unemployment, most workers face a long-term cost of living squeeze. And here's the hard truth: house prices cannot rise forever when incomes don't. Inherited wealth can delay the reckoning, but it can't stop it. So, is it a Ponzi scheme? No, but it is deeply fragile. Decades of selling off social housing without replacing it pushed people into an expensive private rental market. Affordability now depends heavily on parental wealth, widening inequality, and rising interest rates have exposed just how stretched the system really is. Despite all the inherited money sloshing around, prices are still under serious downward pressure. What happens next matters, not just for homeowners, but for an entire generation locked out of stability. If you want to understand how inequality, housing, and money are shaping your future, don't click away. Because once you see the system clearly, you can finally start making smarter choices within it.